Let me start by saying thank you all for coming. Good afternoon. Some of you were on the previous call. Some of you, this is your first call. My name is Steve Alexander from MSP-Ignite, and we're the hosts today. But really, everything today is about your speaker, and that's Tony Kai from Nerdio. And before I get you started, Tony, just a reminder to everybody, these sessions are being recorded. We will email you a copy of the slides as well as a link to the recording afterwards. The presentation is going to go for about 45 minutes, which is going to leave Tony about 12 minutes or so for Q&A, and we will stop it at the end of those 12 minutes. If you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat window. All right. At the end, we'll open it up and tell everyone open up video as well. We'll either read from the chat window or we'll ask you to go ahead and jump right in with your questions. So with that, Tony, it's been a long time, but good to see you again. I feel like we haven't seen each other since the early days of quarantine, but welcome, and I look forward to watching your presentation.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Steve. And yeah, the last time we talked, we were talking about what to do when managing customers as they now move to work from home, right? So what do we do about those endpoint machines that are at home now, right?
Yep.
So that's a good actually segue into this topic, right? Which is Windows Virtual Desktop fundamentals for MSPs. Yeah, my name is Tony Kai. I'm one of the partner sales executives here at Nerdio. A little bit about myself, my background. I was an engineer, a senior network engineer at an MSP for about 10 years. Before coming to Nerdio about 2 years ago, so feel free to blast me with all types of technical questions as well. I can handle it. All right. So we'll talk about Windows Virtual Desktop. So what is Windows Virtual Desktop? So for you guys who don't know it already, it is basically a set of technologies that allow individuals to stream his or her own Windows 10 desktops from any location and pretty much on any device. And what is WVD more specifically? Well, to me, it's a set of technologies that enable managed service providers to deploy virtual desktops in Azure. And WVD is a Azure-only service, and it comprises of these four main things that you see on the screen. Right, we'll go into each one of these topics in detail, but it's an Azure service that allows you to run virtual desktops in Azure using MultiSession Windows version 10 OS. Right, that's one of the big components of WVD. The second component is a component called FSlogix, which is user profile containerization. Again, we'll spend a couple of minutes on each of these in detail a little bit later. The third and sort of my favorite is what's known as the Microsoft hosted control plane that makes up the WVD service. It's a platform as a service layer that runs inside of all of the Azure regions that gives you connectivity into the Azure cloud to be able to use these virtual desktops. And then sort of the last thing they did, and this is one of the major changes, is they really simplified the licensing. And we'll talk about licensing and where it came from and all that in a little bit as well. So just as I go through this and any questions come to mind, please feel free to just ask. All right. So we're going to spend time in each one of these categories. And so before we start, we want to think about what problems does Windows Virtual Desktop solve, right? So number one is the obvious one, right? It's the work from home situation we're all in right now. When we started this pandemic back in March, we did all sorts of stuff to kind of get our customers to work remotely, including setting up point-to-site VPNs, letting customers use TeamViewer and all sorts of go-to-my-PC applications. I've even had MSPs tell me they've used or they've let their customers have access to their LabTech or Kaseya to be able to access their machine groups remotely. So people did all sorts of stuff to get last-ditch effort to get people online, right? But fast forward, 8 months, we're sort of in the same scenario, right? We're now seeing a second wave, and there's sort of like no end in sight as to when we can kind of go back to normal. So a lot of people are now coming to us and saying, hey, we got by back in, March, April. We're looking for a more permanent solution now, right? So either that or customers decided, sort of like us, right? At Nerdio, we decided not to renew our lease in our building come November. We're going to pretty much be 100% remote. So a lot of customers are asking for that type of that work from home scenario. So what do you do at that point, right? So that solves that issue. We'll talk about it a little bit more. We have the scenario where you have multiple offices, right? And this is sort of a pre-pandemic thing even, right? You have a customer with multiple offices and they're looking to sort of decentralize their office, or you know, where you might have a headquarters set up where all your servers are in right now, and people just site-to-site VPN in to get access to those files or line of business apps. So those scenarios where you're looking to kind of get out of the IT closet or move everything to the cloud. A lot of times people think, hey, you know, I have domain controllers and file servers and app servers in the cloud. Let me just take those things and just move them into Azure or some kind of colo or private cloud. But what happens when you move just that over without the virtual desktop piece is that your line of business applications don't really work well, right? And that's sort of problem number 3 is when you host line of business applications in somewhere remote where it's not in the same local area network as your, you know, on-prem hardware, you're going to see some latency where those applications that have a database backend or and stuff like that, you're going to have latency where you're not going to be able to access the application with the same speed as what they're used to on premise, right? And you know, common applications that have that issue are things like QuickBooks and Sage, anything that has a client front end and a database or server backend likely won't work over VPN. Right, so that the WVD will solve that problem. And number 4 is, you know, this is not, you know, I guess my partners who use the Nerdio service and get to the cloud eventually. And I added this in here because this is a problem I see all the time where we end up still managing our endpoint devices the same way we've managed them while we were on premise. So when you do that, not only do you now have to manage the cloud environment, but you still have to maintain and manage the on-prem environment. And you're not really gaining any operational efficiencies when you're doing that, right? So we'll talk about how some of the endpoint or thin client technology that MSPs need to learn and adopt to be able to leverage WVD while staying really efficient. And number 5 is generating monthly recurring revenue in the cloud. You know, we've been selling Office 365 now for about 7 or 8 years. We've been doing that really well, so much so that Microsoft is seeing sort of the plateauing of the adoption of new 365 subscribers, right? So, you know, if you're out there prospecting, you know, you find a customer, they're likely already on 365, either from a previous MSP that's moved them up there or they've kind of moved themselves up there. But it's harder and harder to find that 365 where you can still kind of migrate them to that. And Microsoft knows that.
God forbid, they might be coming from GoDaddy also.
Yeah. So funny thing about GoDaddy, you used to have to kind of do a clean migration. You'd actually do a migration out of GoDaddy without having to remigrate everything now. So a lot of people don't know that, but that's a cool thing that I've been seeing. So Microsoft's saying, all right, well, we're seeing that adoption plateau. We're now asking customers to move their infrastructure into the cloud. But moving infrastructure into the cloud, you know, you can't really make money selling a 365, right? You can't, you know, you can make $1 or $2 at most. You can't really run a business selling 365, but when you sell Azure with WVD, you can make up to like 80% margins or markups and still be very competitive in the market. So those are sort of the 5 things I think WVD solves for us as the MSP. Just looking at sort of all those scenarios, you can kind of in your head kind of gather up like who's a good fit for this type of solution. All right. So before we dive deeper into WVD, we want to sort of think about where WVD really came from, right? What technology existed before that, and why WVD was sort of even created, right? So we have technology that everybody here is familiar with, remote desktop or RDS. Right, the first version of RDS was probably back in the NT days or Windows 2000. It was at the time it was called Terminal Server, and what it really was a Windows Server operating system with a desktop experience. Right, even the later versions, 2016, 2019, they called it the Windows 10 desktop experience. It's basically a Windows Server OS with a desktop skin. And then you have players like Citrix and VMware, right? Citrix had Zen App, Zen Desktop, and then VMware had Horizons. They sort of came to the rescue. They were third-party ISVs or independent software vendors that partnered up with Microsoft to build additional functionality on top of the RDS technology by extending security and functionality and features. Right, and in the enterprise space, you see a lot of use of those tools. So that's, you know, very common in the RDS sort of stack as you get larger, more users. And then we had user profile challenges with RDS, right? So people who are deploying RDS in a SMB scenario would probably find themselves sort of disabling OST caching or inability to use OneDrive. You know, if you were doing just simple profile redirection, you were fine, but if you're doing anything more complex, you'd have to kind of use like UPDs or user profile disks, right? That Microsoft tried to create to manage those profile challenges. But you know, what the profile challenges meant was that if you had a RDS server farm with many different RDS session hosts, your user experience would not be exactly the same depending on which session host your broker put you into. And again, not really a big challenge on the SMB level, but on the enterprise level, it was a big thing that people have to contend and deal with. But of course, there's a workaround for everything, right? So we've been sort of deploying workarounds for these user profile challenges. And then RDS had a lot of like security. I wouldn't say that it's a security issue with RDS itself, but it was the security issues based on how people were deploying it. So a lot of people were deploying, especially in the SMB level, were deploying RDS in a non-best practices, right? So when I say best practice in RDS, Microsoft says best practice in RDS means you put an RD gateway server in the DMZ. You would have that RD gateway server be the public-facing component of RDS, and anybody who logs in through an RD gateway server would get their traffic encrypted before it gets passed along and added into the RDS session host itself. But unfortunately, most MSPs weren't doing things this way, right? I would say sort of in the late 2000s timeframe, it was very common to just enable 3389, and that would be our primary way to remote access our machines and do administrative tasks, right? It was very common in 2009, 2010 timeframe that was sort of very common. But as people started brute forcing and hacking their way into insecure RDS environments or publicly facing RDS environments with weak administrative passwords, people started getting smarter about it, but still they weren't doing things best practice. They were putting it behind a firewall. You would have to SSL VPN into your network before your customer would be able to open up their port 3389. But largely the security issues that come from RDS and what you hear on the internet is because the IT administrator wasn't careful in setting this up. All right, you guys could probably all agree to that. There are large RDS deployments that are set up in best practices and have MFA and all that, and security isn't an issue there. Right. And then last thing about the sort of complexity around licensing. So RDS required a lot of licensing components to consider. You had the RDS session host itself needs the server OS license. You need user CALs, you need RDS CALs to run Office 365 inside of a terminal server or RDS session host. You would have to used to bring an E3 license because that was the only license that had the shared computer activation feature, right? So that was sort of complex. And then the application and compatibility issue, right? So some applications would complain about not wanting to install on the Windows Server, or it's only available to install on the desktop operating system. So we didn't see that too often as time went on, but that was still something that existed. So those are sort of some of the issues and reasons why WVD was created, right? To have an answer to some of these things that we saw in a technology that's been around for 15, 20 years now. All right, so number one, right, that Windows 10 operating system. So why is that such a big deal? So for the first time ever, Microsoft has created a Windows 10 native multi-session operating system. So it was a project led by a guy named Scott Manchester over at Microsoft. About 4 years ago, he got a team of folks from different silos inside of Microsoft. Inside of Microsoft, you had teams that really didn't talk to each other, didn't work together. You had the Office team, right? The Office 365 team. You had the Windows Server team and the Windows 10 team. Those guys were sort of individually working on their products, but now they brought them together under the guy Scott, and he kind of led the team to create a multi-session version of Windows 10, built from the ground up to kind of answer some of the challenges that we saw in the RDS world. So this is innovative because, like I said, for the first time ever, it's a multi-session, VM inside of Azure. And running Windows 10 inside of Azure wasn't a game changer. You could have always done that on a single user setup, but having multiple users log into the same session host allows sort of the cost effects of it to benefit us, right? So on the SMB side, even more so than enterprise, SMB customers are very sensitive to costs. When we're allowed to put multiple users into a larger session host box, gives us the ability to kind of increase our user to core ratio density, which drives the cost down per user per month, right? So this is sort of the enabling technology that enabled virtual desktops to go mainstream on a SMB level. All right, and Microsoft's already talking about this concept of cloud PC and sort of maybe selling a Windows 10 machine alongside your Microsoft 365 license, things like that. That's sort of something to come, but we really don't know much about it at this point. That's, you can kind of bet that that's sort of the future of where Microsoft is going. And because they have the Microsoft sort of Office 365 team kind of developing this under the same leadership, you have certain enhancements that the Microsoft Office suite has for WVD that wasn't always around in the RDS days.
There's a
Sorry?
ticket for David. Wanted to scan.
Okay, somebody's talking. Yeah, so we'll talk about some of the WVD enhancements with the Microsoft Office product suite as well as Teams. I'll show you a demo of that. So what this means is you can pretty much use a Windows 10 device from any device anywhere in the world as long as you have internet. There's a company called N Computing that actually just came out with a Raspberry Pi 4 version of a WVD client. So that little device on the left side there. What that does is it gives you the endpoint device for as low as $40 for the hardware, and you can run 2 monitors on a Windows 10 device from any location, right? WVD works on Android.
It's kind of like a thin client, basically.
Yeah, it's a thin client. I actually have one of my. I can't find it, but it's a little thing that looks like the size
small
of a
you
credit.
can't find it.
It's a credit card size thin client. It's a Raspberry Pi with the enclosure that supports 2 HDMI monitors. So that's if you have any light users, that'd be a really good small device that has management capability that you can roll out. What's that? Oh, because I thought I heard somebody. Okay, so it works on Android phones, iPhones, iPads, Mac, PC, Windows 7, Windows 10 machines. Pretty much any device will run Windows 10 in the cloud. Okay, so the second innovation of WVD, right? The first one was the Windows 10 multi-session approach to running Windows in Azure. The second one is this thing called FSlogix, right? So FSlogix is actually a company that Microsoft acquired in 2018 when they were building the Windows Virtual Desktop product, right? Before the acquisition of FSlogix, they had the technology called User Profile Disk, or UPDs, that had its own issues, right? So instead of sort of fixing the product that they've tried to design and copy, they've basically just had the money and bought out the entire company, FSlogix. So they bought them, and they've incorporated their technology into the WVD product. So what FSlogix does is actually separate the user desktop from the desktop OS from the user profiles. So if you think about it this way, if you have a physical Windows 10 machine joined to the same domain, if you had the same user, let's say Tony, logging into computer A or computer 1, I'd open up my Outlook, I would cache all my files, I'd open up my OneDrive, cache all my files, and everything would be stored inside my C, user, and Tony folder, right? But if I logged into a second computer in the same domain and I opened those same files, well, I have to recache everything again and resync everything from OneDrive because the data in computer number 1 doesn't exist in data computer number 2. So when you're using a multi-session type of setup, FSlogix actually handles that really well. So remember, it separates the Windows 10 operating system from the user profiles. It actually puts the user profile data and encapsulates it, and it's in a form of a VHD file. So a VHD file is an image file that gets stored on some kind of SMB share. So that SMB share location could be a file server with a shared out path. It could be Azure files. It could be Azure NetApp files. It all kind of depends on your deployment size. But basically, the VHD file contains everything inside the app user data folder, right? So this app data folder, that's the OST files, that's your OneDrive cache files, any of your specific application files that are all within your user profile. And whenever you log into a Windows 10 machine, that profile pretty much gets attached and mounted onto the Windows 10 machine, all under the hood. So the Windows 10 operating system actually doesn't know that profile is not actually local to the machine. Because once you log in, you can navigate to the C user folder, and everything would look like it's normally where it's supposed to be. But the vice versa happens when you log off. That user profile simply deattaches itself from the Windows 10 machine, and it returns back to its shared path location. So what this allows us to be able to do is actually make these Windows machines very portable. So you might have heard in larger environments where you have new Windows 10 machines being redeployed every single day. So every time a user logs in the next day, they actually get a brand new Windows 10 machine with their profiles are mounted and attached. So every single day they get a brand new new computer experience, right? So the notion of sort of the customer installing malware by accident the night before, you can guarantee sort of by the next morning that machine has completely been reimaged and gone. Right. So this technology allows us to deal with these Windows 10 images in a very portable fashion. Okay. I saw a couple of questions come in, so let me take a chance to answer them. What is the Raspberry Pi name again? Yeah, the Raspberry Pi is made from a company called N Computing. It's based off of Raspberry Pi with their own enclosure. It's called N Computing. There's other companies that do this as well. And another great one is iGel, and I'll show you maybe one of their products. There's another product called the UD Pocket. It's basically a little USB device that lets you boot into the USB device to run Windows Virtual Desktop if you don't want to confuse the end user with the endpoint device that has an underlying operating system in it. I'll go over that in a little bit. So that is FSlogix, the ability to separate the user profiles from the OS. And this is a big deal in WVD and the ability to make WVD very portable from an IT administrative perspective. Okay, so this one is my third and favorite sort of piece to WVD, right? The multi-session Windows 10 is great, but at the end of the day, it's just a Windows 10 machine that allows me to log on multiple users, right? Not so fancy, but this one I think is great, right? So we talked about how in RDS deployments, most SMB customers are not deploying them in Microsoft best practices, right? Because why would you, right? Best practice means you need an RD gateway server, you need an RD connection broker, maybe a licensing server, maybe an RD web server. So if you have a 10 user customer, you're not going to deploy 4 or 5 machines just to have RDS working in a small customer, right? So that's probably one of the reasons why things were never sort of done this way, is because too much management, too much overhead, too many licensing, too much stuff to patch and keep up, right? Those are all the reasons why service providers did not install these roles on a regular basis. But because these are sort of the best practices that you had to have in RDS, now the WVD control plane now gives you all these services in a hosted fashion, which means Microsoft now hosts and manages it for you. You don't have to manage and patch them as different VMs anymore. It is a platform as a service layer inside of every Azure region. So Microsoft is now going to patch the gateway, patch your broker, patch your web access server, your diagnostics. All that is a service given to you as long as you have the entitlement to use Windows Virtual Desktop. And why is this cool? Well, that's basically because now every single deployment, no matter how big or small the client is going to leverage Azure's best practices WVD control plane. Right? No more VMs you have to patch and pay for, no more licensing you have to buy. Okay, so the other cool thing about that platform as a service for WVD's control plane is that it's available across most Azure regions, right? So Azure's got 62 regions and growing, more regions than AWS and Google combined. And every single one of these dots is basically an entry point into WVD. So let me just pause right here and kind of talk about regions a little bit, because a lot of people have misconceptions about what an Azure region is. An Azure region is not a single building. It is not a cluster of buildings. It is multiple clusters of buildings that make up an Azure region. So whenever you have data running in an Azure data center, your data is actually running in, well, it's not running in 3 places, but your data is stored in 3 places within the same region, right? So if, let's say, you have an Azure region by a big highway and a tractor trailer rolls down the hill, brakes fail and they crash into the wall and then it hits your Azure data center where your data is actually running. Well, your data is actually stored in 2 other locations in the same region, opposite sides of each other, which means that sometimes these clusters of data centers within the same region are hundreds of miles apart from each other. So the chances of your data going down or something blowing up or something, it's rare that your data will be lost even within the same region, even if you don't take advantage of out of region disaster recovery. So I just kind of want to clear that out first. When we talk about regions, a region is not a single building. It's multiple clusters of buildings, sometimes hundreds of miles apart from each other. But yeah, every single one of these dots is an entry point into WVD. So what does that mean? So let's say I have a hypothetical scenario. I have a customer in New York City. They're a law firm, and they have a large RDS infrastructure that the IT is hosting, right? And one of the partners sort of go on vacation, and they go somewhere really far away. So let's say they go to Australia. right? And the you know, is with his family, he's on vacation, and he wants to work, right? And he's in his hotel room. So if he had RDS, he would actually open up his RDS, maybe VPN tunnel back into the New York office, and try to get his remote desktop, you know, through the wide area or public area network internet, right? So all that network congestion or the traffic, he has to pretty much go from Australia back to the New York City office for him to get his desktop. And just because he's so far away, his experience is going to be really poor because of just the vast distance and the milliseconds response back, right? It's going to be really high. Now, if you had WVD, what's really cool about it is WVD itself, the client will automatically find the closest path to the Azure region that's closest to where the user's logging in from. And once he hops onto the closest region, because all these Azure regions are interconnected to each other using dark fiber or direct connecting fiber underneath the water of the oceans, he'll actually hop onto the closest region, let's say it's Australia East, and then ride the Azure fiber pipe back to the US East data center, bypassing all public traffic, right? Reducing all latency to get to his virtual desktop. So I think that's my favorite reason that this is you know, the coolest part of WVD is because you can pretty much run a managed services company from anywhere in the world and have clients anywhere where there's a dot in this map, right? Because that's your entry point into WVD, right? So you literally be anywhere. You don't have to be sort of stuck to your geographic area anymore. And then the next and the last thing about licensing, and we talked about how complex RDS licensing was, that the fact that every single RDS role or session host requires a Windows OS license. Each user uses their user cal. Each RDS user needs an RDS cal. And before, when you wanted to run Office 365, you needed an E3 license because of that shared computer activation feature. But WVD has sort of scratched all that from the drawing board, and they said that was too complicated, which they were correct. Now you need a Microsoft 365 Business Premium SKU, which covers the cost of the Windows 10 operating system or the WVD entitlement. It comes with the Office apps, Exchange Online, Teams, you know, all types of security features, all in one SKU, right? So no more RDS gateway, broker roles, no more RDS cows, no more user cows. All that can be done with the Microsoft 365 Business Premium SKU. So you can see that, of course, Microsoft just renamed their SKU type, but the M365 Business Premium is what you need. Comes with Office, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, comes with ATP, Intune, all the security features, and Windows Virtual Desktop. Right, so if you guys are running Microsoft 365 Business Standard now, which has been very popular over the years, or AKA formerly 365 Business Premium, you're going to want to upgrade to that. This SKU is $20 MSRP. So another question come in. Do you still need an Azure server to use as a file server? That is one of the methods for storing your FSlogix profiles. There are other methods as well, like Azure Files and NetApp Files for larger deployments. But the smallest way to go, the cheapest way to go, is to use a file server to store the profiles. So we talked a lot about.
How does it look like? So what is needed? Like, let's say a company with 20 users. What will be the actual infrastructure we need to get from Microsoft to make that happen with WVD?
Yeah, perfect. So this is exactly the screen we're on. So I was going to say that we talked a lot about sort of in theory what WVD really is and how it works, but we'll talk about how it really works, right? So if you look at this infrastructure diagram here, this is a very typical SMB customer's layout and deployment of WVD. So you have a Active Directory server, either as a VM running in Azure or on-premise, right? And the Active Directory server has a AD Connect, syncing their AD objects to Office 365. You have the file server. Remember, look at the file server. It has the FSlogix profiles. You can use that file server to store your regular map drive shared data. You can use the file server to run your printers and print off of that as well. So acting like a print server. You have the WVD management service on the top that sits on the edge that filters and encrypts all your traffic coming into your LAN network. And you have your WVD pooled desktop, right? So your WVD pooled desktop is that Windows 10 multi-session setup. And then, of course, on the bottom left-hand corner, you have optionally, if your client uses application servers or database servers, that's where it would go, right? So everything kind of here is in the same local area network in your customer's Azure subscription. What I wanted to show you really was that this is not any really different than what you guys have been doing on premise for physically for all these years, right? You have maybe where the WVD management service was where your firewall is. Maybe the LAN subnet is your switch. Maybe your pool desktop is your individual physical PCs. And the reason I'm showing you this is the same thing we've been doing for many, many years. I don't want to, say, hey, WVD is this magical service. It's not really magic. The same components you need on an on-prem environment, you're just doing the same thing, but doing it in Azure.
Hey, Tony, that's that WVD piece up at the top, that management, that's the bundle of gateway, broker, web server,
Exactly.
blah,
Yep.
blah, blah, right?
Yep. Yeah, you don't have to patch it anymore. It's not a VM. You get to touch. It's just you assume that it works, right? Like with Azure AD and all the authentication, all the MFA happens on that layer before your connection is allowed to come into your LAN subnet.
Great, thank you.
So this visual should help kind of piece things together. Where in theory we talked about the services and what the features of it was, but physically this is how it looks like. Right. So when you talk about deploying WVD, we want to make sure we have all the right components to start the deployment, right? So in Azure in general, some of you guys had stayed for the demystifying Azure portion of Joseph's, I guess series of the webinar, and we talked about a lot about subscriptions and sort of terminology to get to Azure, but we'll review that today. So if you're using Nerdio to deploy WVD, of course you need a Nerdio account, right? So go to getnerdio.com, sign up for a Nerdio trial. You also need a subscription from your CSP distributor, right? So you go to your CSP distributors, tell them you want to set up Azure. They'll set you up with a CSP subscription. You need a Microsoft 365 Business Premium license, right? So that Microsoft 365 license was the license that gave you WVD. So if your customers have anything but an M365, or even if they have an E3 license, it's a good idea to or switch them or upgrade them to the M365 Business Premium license. It's a way better SKU than E3 ever was. It gives you a lot more for the same price, right? And this mistake I see a lot is people say they have an Azure subscription, but that user they're trying to log into doesn't either have global admin rights or ownership roles. So make sure you're global admin of the tenant and owner of the subscription, right? There's those two caveats that get people all the time. And a lot of partners come to us and say, hey, we have an Action Pack account, or we have a Silver Partnership account with some Azure credits. Can I use that to test my set up a POC, right? The answer is yes, you can use that, but be aware that those free type of accounts have something called a Azure Core Quota limit that you have to request to increase. So you can contact me if you want. I can give you instructions on how to increase your core quota. It doesn't cost any money to increase your core quota, but increasing core quota will let you pretty much have full reign of that Action Pack, right? Otherwise, you'll be pretty restricted on what you can do with the Action Pack or the Silver account. This core quotas doesn't apply to CSP subscriptions, only to free subscriptions, right? And then I would say the last thing is just get ready to learn something new. Azure is very different, but now it's the time to learn it. I made the transition about 2 years ago, and man, it challenges you in all different types of ways, but it's good, right? Because if you don't, we sort of end up doing the same thing we've always done, and sort of lag behind. So before I go into a demo of like what WVD is and how it works, I'd stop here and sort of maybe anybody have any questions or want to unmute yourself, have a conversation.
So you talked about that E3 thing, which is now premium. There used to be a Pro Plus SKU, which is now called something else. Is that not recommended, Tony?
Yeah, so the Pro Plus will give you the access to install the apps on the MultiSession machine, but it doesn't actually give you the rights to use WVD. So I've done the math. Either way you cut it, the cheapest way to get to get WVD is the M365 Business Premium SKU. If you have a customer, and this is if you have a customer that, let's say, for example, uses G Suite and they don't use Microsoft Word or Excel or anything like that, you can get away with the Windows 10 E3 license, which is $7 per user per month to activate WVD. That's if you don't use the Office suite, which far between now, right? We pretty much everybody uses Office apps. So if you use Office apps plus you want WVD entitlement, the best SKU to get is the M365 Business Premium.
Cool, thanks.
How about some type of license play with Jump Cloud? Is this something that you've seen happening?
Yeah, so Jump Cloud. So there's a very specific thing. So remember, I said that WVD was an Azure only service, And the reason why it's Azure only, it's because of the control plane only being in Azure, but also that WVD has a really deep connection into Azure AD. So Jump Cloud is a alternative directory sort of service, right? And you need Azure AD. That's a must-have. You can't not have. You can't run RDS. Like you know how RDS you could run RDS with just a domain controller and nothing else in Azure. WVD is a Azure service that has a lot of tie-ins and hooks into Azure AD.
Thank you.
So if you have a domain controller running either on premise or in the cloud, you actually need Azure AD Connect syncing to Azure AD before you can even use WVD. So that's a requirement.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I will minimize this PowerPoint and I will get to my desktop here. So I have a purple background. The purple background signifies my physical computer. You'll see in a second when I log into my virtual desktop that I've made that background a little bit different because a lot of end users sort of get confused, right? So that brings up the other topic about efficiency in the cloud. So a lot of partners set up WVD for their customers, but they end up managing their endpoint devices the same way that using RMM. Now you got 2 RMM agents, and you got 2 antivirus agents, one on the virtual desktop, one on the premise machine, right? Now the one on the virtual desktop, you only use 1 agent for both. For these multi-session machines, it only requires 1 agent, but still you have to manage 2 environments almost now. So that end computing device I talked about in the beginning with the Raspberry Pi was one option you have. The other option you have is talked about these iGel clients. So this is really interesting as well. It's called an iGel UD Pocket, and they're size of like your thumb basically, and you let the users carry this around, and wherever they run to a computer that they want to use as the virtual desktop terminal, you would take that thing, plug it into a machine, reboot the machine, it boots off that USB. It's a read-only Linux operating system, which sole purpose is to get you into WVD. So think about that, right? You have, let's say, old Windows 7 machines around. You just buy these little devices. They're about $30 each. Plug them in, reboot the machine, and now you have a WVD compliant machine where it doesn't need to boot into the underlying operating system. It boots into the operating system inside this device and gets you into WVD. So if you have a customer working from home, maybe they're using their son's gaming machine, right? You don't really know if there's any sort of keyloggers on that machine, right? But you want a safe encrypted environment. You would buy something like this, set this up, and then give it to the end user. They log in and they get to the virtual desktop bypassing the Windows operating system.
So,
right? That's another way to avoid confusion.
So Tony, do you need VPN to be able to securely connect, or is it just straight in whatever HTML5 or whatever, some sort of HTTPS connection in?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So to get to WVD, you actually need a client, a WVD client. So this right here is the WVD client made for Windows, and they have one for iOS, for Mac, for HTML5 is another way to kind of get into WVD, but the client is sort of the primary way to get in. So this client is very similar to Citrix Receiver, if you guys have used that. Basically, you log into the customer's Azure AD credentials, right? Same credentials for their Office 365, and you'll be sort of given sort of the applications that you decide that they can have access to. So I have here a couple of examples. Now, this is not a fair example, because this is an example where I've connected to multiple customers, but they would pretty much see one bar and then maybe a couple of apps and then their desktop is what people would see. So there's multiple ways to access WVD or publish applications, right? So one method is to publish applications. So maybe you've just replaced these Windows 10 machines just January of last year, and the customer sees it as sunk cost, and you don't want to replace their physical desktops with virtual machines. But yet you still have that Sage application that you want to deploy in the cloud because their servers are aging and you need to replace them. You can put the servers and the application in Azure and publish that application as a remote app. So it pretty much opens up like a regular application. You can see if I show details, it's actually logging into a real Windows 7 machine. But once it logs in, it shows me my application. And the application looks like it's local, even though it's in the cloud. So you can see the little icon down in the tray here. You see the little remote app icon. That signifies that this application is not running on a local machine. So you can publish any application. And what's really cool is when you log into this application, it also injects the apps that you have into your start menu. So you can kind of pull the icons out and make little shortcuts on the desktop to really further reduce confusion, right? If you have a customer that's not used to doing this, giving them something like this, if you don't train them well, they're going to get confused. But if you make it so seamless that it's just another icon, then they double click it and it's running from the cloud. That's sort of, step one into getting to the cloud, right? If you have a customer sort of either just renewed their hardware or maybe very averse to confusion, right?
Tony, I have a question.
Sure.
One of the things that what's her name, Citrix has been doing much better than RDS and RDP connections in the past was the audio and video quality. Yes. How does that compare to this solution?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'll show you that right now, actually. So I'm gonna close out this remote app, but remote app is one way to, get WVD or use WVD. So the second way to get WVD would be logging into a full-fledged desktop environment, right? So if I click this desktop, I'm gonna load my WVD desktop, and you can see here that I've made this desktop background blue, so I can avoid confusion. I get confused myself sometimes, right? If I'm having multiple things open. So this blue background is my virtual desktop. I have multiple people logged into this machine, right? And anything that installs on a Windows 10 machine can be installed in WVD. But to answer your question, Teams is the only application that is now optimized for WVD in terms of audio and camera redirection. So what I'm going to do is actually stop my video share on Zoom and go into my video inside of Teams, inside of a WVD session host, right? So I'm inside a WVD session host. I go to devices. You can see that there's no lag. I'm talking. There's no lag. There's no audio lag. There's no video lag, right? Everything just works fine. Yeah. So that is one of the improvements that remember I talked about how Scott Manchester pulled guys from the different teams. This is one of the enhancements they made with Windows Virtual Desktop from an Office perspective. Right, no lag.
As far as you know, that's the only application that has that support for nice, clear, crisp video streaming.
Correct. So if you're using, Zoom or WebEx, it will still work. It's just you're going to be sort of redirecting video traffic into WVD and having the similar experiences as you did in RDS.
Thank you. Another question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You didn't have to put any credentials to log in. Is this because you had credentials on your desktop?
Yeah, I'm single signed on in, and I have MFA turned off for this demo account.
Okay, but if you did have MFA, it will run every time you open every program, or it's going to be just for
you get to configure that in the conditional access policies. So you get to set it up where if you want to ask once an hour, once a day, every time, you can adjust that.
Thanks.
Okay, I have some chat coming in, so let me read some of that. Okay, we use Barracuda Cloud Gen firewalls. We found that the BGP with Azure. VPN is connected. Yeah, so Bill, you're using some kind of so everything we do here in Nerdio is using the WVD control plane, which means your traffic's not going through any firewall. If you're using a third-party firewall appliance for sort of IPS or anything like that, yeah, we can have a separate conversation about that because this one's not specific to this particular topic. But yeah, just hit me up afterwards if you have that question. Does this client utilize 2FA? Yes, it does. 15-minute warning. Thank you. Yeah. So that's the demo, right? So the full desktop, the remote apps. So let me go back to the PowerPoint. I don't really have much left, but yeah, so Nerdio empowers MSPs to build successful cloud practices in Microsoft Azure. And how we do that is, when we talk to MSPs all the time, there's, 4 difficult challenges when MSP faces when getting into Azure, right? Number one is usually, well, I don't have the skill set or the manpower to deploy a service like this, right? I've been doing this for 15 years on premise. Azure's new to me. How do we get started, right? So that's issue number one, is sort of the, unless you have a level 3, Azure certified architect, it's very hard to sort of set this up from scratch, right? If you've never done it before. The second thing I hear about challenges for getting into Azure is, the pricing is very complex. I've played with the pricing calculator. It shows me a price that's super expensive. I'm not really sure if I'm missing anything else. Like, how do I become confident that the price is the price and doesn't fluctuate every month, right? So that's another thing that I hear all the time, probably more so than the first, as a reason why MSPs aren't just going to Azure, right? Just those complexities. And then number 3 is sort of day-to-day management of an Azure environment, right? Again, you've been managing on-premises infrastructure for many years, managing the Azure environment. How's it different? How's it, how do I get a handle on that on day one, right? And then lastly is optimization of the Azure environment. So one of the reasons why an Azure environment might be expensive is you're not optimizing it in the way that you should. So Nerdio will help you with that, right? We'll help you with the reservations, with the Azure Hyper Benefits, with the scaling in, scaling out, all those configurations. We pretty much have a DevOps technology built into our product that'll help you reduce the cost of your build, so you can pretty much make money, but still remain very competitive in the market. Right. So I'll stop here, and I'll just kind of pull up my contact information if anybody wants to reach out to me or afterwards, or I can do some Q&A now with the remaining time we have left.
Any other questions, anybody? Tony, I don't know if you got to that last one from Chris Long.
Yeah, I'm reading that now. Can you have WVD cloud and still let clients contact their on-premise files? The answer is yes, you can, right? The only way to do that would be setting up a site-to-site VPN between Azure and then joining it to the same domain as your on-premise infrastructure, so you can pretty much create a GPO policy to map that drive across the VPN tunnel. For files, that's okay, but if you have application servers on premise with databases, I wouldn't do it that way. Again, you're going to run into that issue where you have latency, just the reverse effect of it, right? So instead of putting servers in the cloud and having PCs stay on premise, you're putting PCs in the cloud and having your servers stay on premise. So that's also the same problem, but the opposite direction. But if it's simple files, then yes, you can. Another question. Okay, cool.
Anyone else? Any additional questions?
I thought I saw someplace there was a configuration for GPU. Are we saying this is potentially an option for, let's say, AutoCAD users or something?
Yeah, so there's actually 2 GPU families in Azure that you can pick from. They're both NV series, one from NVIDIA and one from AMD. The AMD one just came out, I would say, a couple of months ago, and it's far cheaper than the NVIDIA solution. But yeah, we have customers using AutoCAD, Revit, SolidWorks. Any of those GPU-intensive applications will work with WVD, right? The only difference between that and a regular non-GPU machine is that you'll be able to run the 3D workloads with it. So.
Very cool. Thanks.
Yep. And of course, the cost is a little bit more, right? Because you have the GPU capability, but.
Yeah. Thanks. Great presentation, Tony.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Tony, good job. If there are no other questions, we're going to move on, but we're not rushing anybody. So if anyone has anything else, raise your hand, wave in the window, ask in the chat. There you go, Tony. You got another one up there.
Yeah, what are cases that are not ideal for WVD? Yes, so non-ideal cases are if you have customers that are using like peripherals that are not sort of regular human interface devices, right? So if you're using like a dental office and they have a they have a peripheral like that is a dental device that plugs into USB, like unless you try it and test it, I can't guarantee you 100% that it'll work, right? Because USB pass-through works, but again, it's all about the drivers and in multi-user mode. But if you have a normal like mouse, printer, keyboard, scanner, webcam, all those are normal devices.
Do you consider Signature Pad a normal device?
That's a human interface device, a normal device, yep.
Okay.
So any like office take-in or any like medical office that has a high scan volume, things like that, that'll be fine. Hover printing, any issues there? No issues with printing. If you have the WVD client handles the printer redirection, or you can just set up a site-to-site tunnel and install the printer on a file server and use it as a print server. Now, scanning on the other hand, if you do high volume scanning, there's a third-party piece of software called TSCAN you might want to install. But TSCAN basically
works.
Yeah, it works great. Yeah, TSCAN basically makes it so that virtual desktop is it's almost like faster than scanning to a local machine. It's unbelievable how it works. But yeah, that one. Thanks.
Fantastic. Anyone else? Well, I've put
last one. Sorry, like most people are starting to use hosted VoIP with a thin client, at least in our case. Having the app on the cloud is something that always had issues on our end. So the audio, not the video portion of it, obviously we spoke about that, but the audio, did you find it to be streamlined enough and easy to use?
It's hit or miss. So I've heard, like, if you're using Zoltis, it works great. If you're using, like, I don't know, 8x8, that could be some problems. Like, it depends on the vendor. Like 5.9s is an issue I've heard. But Microsoft is now offering PBX on Teams. So if you use that, there's going to be no problem doing that. But, you know, you're going to want to try it, or ask me for a specific one, because I've seen so many deployments where people have tried certain things. And I sort of have a mental list of things that don't work or have told me somebody has problems with, but then there are some that work just fine.
Thanks.
It depends on the SIP app, SIP client.
Fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Sure.